Hello, everybody. Welcome. Glad to have some time together. I'm out on a walk, as I often am when I'm making recordings. It's a difficult day in the bare beginnings of a truly difficult time. A couple of days ago, I was in the botanical gardens, and I really wanted to become involved in a conversation that I overheard, but it seemed that it wasn't entirely appropriate. And that's not the only arbiter of decision making that I employ. Sometimes it's incredibly important to be inappropriate. And at other times, well, let's just say that there are different layers of what's appropriate and not, depending on our concerns and what we're paying attention to. But I was listening to, as I walked past them, a family. There was a young boy, probably 7, maybe his twin sister on his right, and his mother was there. And another woman was there who was probably a friend of his mother's. And he was saying, "Mom, something's wrong with my dreams." And I don't think he was capable of articulating what was wrong with his dreams to his mom at that moment. But he went on to say, "I feel like time is wrong. I have too much time. And the week that has just passed happened 3 times. It was like 3 weeks." And I thought, oh, I'd really love to hear everything this young boy has to say about these 2 topics. But I was just passing by, and it didn't seem reasonable to involve myself in a private conversation that I'd accidentally overheard. So I didn't. Another of my friends, who I was talking with the other day, one of her confidants, who's a planetary scientist, had told her of a dream that happened pretty recently, in which he was talking with some people, and he asked some kind of question. I can't remember what it was. Something like, "Where are we?" And the people said, "Oh, you're from a planet that was third from its sun? And he said, yeah. And they said, well, we're sorry to have to tell you this, but that planet, that whole solar system is gone. And we can't tell you, there's going to be a lot of noise here for a minute. We can't tell you whether or not it disappeared in the past or in the future, but that whole system is gone. And one moment. He went out and looked at the sky, and he saw the sun, but it wasn't our sun. And this is an important dream. I pay a lot of attention to dreaming, and for some time now, there's been a problem there. A number of problems, actually. And not just for me, though not for everybody. In times of radical transformation, we're certainly in one now. Each of the humans is sensing uniquely. And I recall a time not so long ago maybe 2.5 years ago or something, where I could sense very deeply that something had gone wrong, really seriously wrong. Something was changing. And it seemed to have something to do with time. And as time proceeded, a series of transformations occurred for me. And they were pretty grim. And this was quite some time before the pandemic. And I wasn't the only one. A number of people that I know, each of them different, sort of in the way that they're in the world, began to have similar trouble with memory, cognition, emotions, dreaming, sleep, health. And it was a very confusing situation, and still remains quite mysterious, though. I've come to understand things that have shed some light on some of the issues there. Primarily, the people who reported sensing something were people who are uniquely sensitive. And some of those people are unusually minded in that the way that they're in consciousness is not like ordinary people. I don't know if there is such a thing as ordinary people. It seems to me an abstract idea that's worth questioning very deeply. In fact, questioning it will pay off profoundly, because it's one of these verbal fictions that we play with all the time without being aware of how ridiculous it is, and also how confusing and dangerous it is. And this goes back to the idea of what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and why, and how do we figure that out? Well, one of the ways we figure it out is by doing a very lazy kind of statistical analysis and thinking about what we might refer to as most people. But our most people models aren't like most people at all, and in fact, all people are radically transformed by context, relations, circumstance, and so on. Now, the thing about time is that it's fundamentally a matter of relationships. Anyone can understand that if there are 0 relationships, there can't be time. If there was just one undecomposable object, and that's all there was, then there's no time. This isn't good. Oh, this is kind of good. Oh, it's the turkey bird. I wonder if this is the girl I know. The girl turkey that I haven't seen in so long. I think it might be. At first I thought it was a potentially injured goose.
They can fly better than I think people think. They can really get up there. They roost in trees a lot, so they'll fly up in a tree.
Yeah, I haven't seen her in a long time, and I'm pretty sure it's her. She found a safer place.
I bet they keep it nice and warm.
And as you can see, her emergence in my experience has changed me right now. The context now includes a being that I love very much and have been concerned about for a long time. And of course, this could be a different female, but I strongly suspect it isn't. It's close enough to her old stomping grounds. And she's a really intelligent animal. She stayed alive in an incredibly difficult situation. And part of why she may have moved is that in the old places where she wandered, during the pandemic, many coyotes came. And that makes it harder for her to survive, because they're predators that are interested in her. Yeah, the appearance of this bird has completely derailed my previous train of thought. And of course my thought wasn't a train at all. But there was a path. I guess I was talking about norms and how we think about them, and how confused that usually is. Because to understand norms in any reasonable way, we'd have to have some purchase on the incredible diversity of contexts and relationships and momentary situations in which humans find themselves or that they travel into. Time transforms for us. It isn't that our machines don't keep ticking or that the sun stops in the sky, though there are places where something like that can happen. but rather our ideas about time are profoundly confused by the fact of our deriving our understandings from machines, clocks. So that each minute is just another one of those intervals of 60 seconds. And again, it's not that that's not true in the limited scope that it encompasses. Surely, in that scope, it's true-ish. But the nature of time for living beings is nothing like the nature of time for clocks or humans watching them. Because our time is emerging in an experiential manifold that is both highly distributed in that it's the result of all the living beings and all the beings who've ever lived, and probably beings who have not yet lived. There's all those relationships, and then there's layers and layers of relations that are closer to us. From our nations, our continents, to our cities, to our families and our extended relational envelopes. There's all kinds of layers of relation in our moments. And way down deep, around here, time is alive. And frankly, I tend to think of time as a strange kind of being that includes other beings. Now, that's not hard to understand since, although you contain trillions of cells, you are not a cell. You are some kind of strange superposition over that population, over time and place and circumstance and relation. And of course, that's not what you are either. That's a rather clinical idea. What you actually are is fundamentally mysterious. And probably isn't even a what, or necessarily a who. I think a lot about the earth and the sun and local space-time and light and time and the moon and the stars and the trees and the animals, the living places, the insects, the fishes, the amphibians, the reptiles, the fungi, the lichens, the mosses, the flowers, the herbs. Because to me, I am an extension of them and they are an extension of me. And if something fundamentally changes for them, then something will fundamentally change for me. Now, it may or may not be reversibly true that to the same degree, if something changes for me, something changes for them. But I think the idea I wanted to highlight is that the earth isn't merely a being, but our world is definitely not a thing. Though it can be categorized this way. And this is one of the problems with our language. Our categories are tragically malformed. That's a process that's been going on, that deformation of our categories for thousands of years. As we became settled city builders and tool makers, and became capable of more abstract kinds of thinking, the diverse dimensionality of the categories underneath language underwent successive catastrophes of deforestation, essentially flattening toward abstract, disembodied, paraclinical, mechanical models. Thus you hear things like, well, the heart is a pump. No. A pump is a derivation of a tiny portion of the function of our hearts. It's a mechanical derivation. Then you hear things like, oh, your brain is a computer. That's like saying, well, since you and cartoons are both animated, you're a cartoon. You're a cartoon. And of course, there's something playfully interesting about the idea of being a cartoon, but that's not what I mean. And then we hear even more ridiculous assertions that go, this is, by the way, how the categories collapsed. They collapsed partly under the influence of a succession of what I'd call attacks on the supercontainer. Attacks on the supercontainer are ideological assaults that want to collapse the everything into a deliverable idea. So, for example, the universe is just a simulation. Right? That kind of idea is a symptom of mind damage, extreme mind damage. And it's not that there's nothing valuable or useful about ideas like this if we see them as playthings that allow us to have perspectives we might not otherwise have and form questions we might not otherwise form. But when they're posed as declarations of fact, this is what the universe is, quote, a simulation, unquote, that's a nightmare. The supercontainer is the origin position in cognition of identity. And so whatever you think the universe is or isn't, all other beings, situations, processes, ideas inherit both the flaws and the staggering incompleteness that results from collapsing the supercontainer to a deliverable, to a token. So there were other collapses before the simulation one, and one of them was the universe is a place where the gods are at war, or God is at war with evil, or something like this. And over time, this nightmare kept doubling down on itself. To produce weaponizations of supercontainer attacks that essentially claimed that some group of people have discovered the correct supercontainer attack, and if you accept their particular assault on the supercontainer, then you'll live in paradise forever. And if you don't accept their particular assault on the supercontainer, you and possibly your children and so on and so forth, all the people you love, everything, will be tortured forever. Forever. And you can see there the mark of a weaponized idea, right? Impossible promises, of both redemption and damnation. But the earth is a non-ordinary situation in the sense that we don't have a category that can encompass the identity of the world. And in fact, when we're trying to do things like this, there's a lot of problems that are really fundamental and simple that were never resolved. In truth, our knowledge systems don't know the first thing about anything. And since we don't know the first thing, we have to invent it. And when we invent it, we're usually doing something ridiculous that we're not aware of. And then everything else inherits the problems of a bad first move, right? Now this whole first move thing is really interesting because, well, I should come back to that. What I mean is, by we don't know the first thing about anything, is that no one knows the first thing. What is the most crucially important foundation of identity before we make any further divisions? Right? So if we knew something like, and of course we couldn't know this completely, but what I mean is just a bit more correctly than we know it at present. If we knew something like, what is time-space doing? And a more naive version is, what is time-space for? Then, having made at least a not terribly erroneous first move, all the other identities would inherit from that first move a position of authenticity or verity. But we humans don't know the first thing about anything, not in our formal cognition anyway. Though perhaps inside us, secretly, held and protected from the dangerous analyses of the waking consciousness, there may be ancient knowledge of original light and being. In fact, I strongly suspect there is. I would go ahead and say there is. Sometimes I'm too careful in my language. So, the mysteries of being, I think we're carrying, each one of us uniquely, we're carrying sort of hidden treasure about these matters. What is time? What is light? Why are we born? And we can find traditions in which people have gone very deep in seeking to understand about these things. And most of those traditions pose the universe as a kind of illusion, not exactly a simulation. But a series of overlays that get reinforced over time until they begin to emerge in physical forms. And these are like the Eastern yogic traditions and the traditions of Buddhism and perhaps Taoism, although with Taoism it's a little different than just, well, actually I'm not entirely sure. So, if we understand that we don't know the first thing, we can start to learn. But if we think we know the first thing, then we're confused. And what I was trying to say is that whatever the earth might be, it isn't a thing, and it's not merely a being, though it can be rendered thus in language or thought, for convenience, for the sake of convenience. One of the ways I think about the earth is an anciently evolved biorelational hyperstructure that expresses the character of time-space in organisms and relationships and forms that are impossible out in free space, but around here are unimaginably common. The living places and beings and so on. So by a hyperstructure, I mean a structure with many invisible, complex dimensions that aren't ordinary and are unlike our common ideas. But they are accessible to our experience because we're made of them. And even though the earth isn't merely a being, I think of the earth as having qualities of a being, in the sense that the earth has senses, and those senses are made of living beings. And their relationships. She has other senses too. She has senses appropriate to her scale of existence. Probably the earth has friends. And one of them is the sun. And one of them is the moon. Those are nearby friends. But in the same way that I can make a telephone call and reach somebody on the other side of the planet, the earth is fully capable of calling out for help. And once I was shown some stories about her history by a being that wasn't human. And it was clear that she'd experienced many extinction events where most of her senses suddenly disappeared, and that these events were like having a stroke. And they're frightening to the earth, in the same way having a stroke is frightening to a human being. Whatever time might be for the world, it's not like our time. Who knows what a minute is for her? It might be 1,000,000 years. But even if it's 1,000, she senses time, and so do we. And we don't talk about our time senses. We suppose that our predictive abilities are tied primarily to our representational intelligence and its religion of cause and effect in flat space, in flat time. And the only place you find flat space and flat time is in human thinking. But we have other senses that we don't have words for. Although one of the words we might use is prophetic, in that they are time senses. And each of us has these senses uniquely, and each of us will pay more or less attention to them under various circumstances. That's important. But we also have a fundamental sense, like the sense of the child who was talking with his mother and said, "Something's wrong with time." Now, I think his poor mother had no idea what to make of such an assertion. But it's really important if one's child comes to their parent and says, he's saying something really non-trivial here. Unfortunately, the parents aren't really equipped to respond to that very well. A few weeks previous to that, I was listening into a conversation as I was passing, and one woman said to another, and they were very happy to be talking and energized and cheerful. She said, "I don't understand it, but something's gone haywire with time. the time is all wrong. I can't tell what day it is. I can't tell what time it is. And the other woman agreed and said, yeah, I understand what you mean. It seems like time is broken. There are, in our temporal senses, fundamental elements that we follow so that we can understand not just where we're at, but where we've been and where we're going and so on. And a number of strange things have happened over the past few years. Quite before the pandemic. The pandemic seems sauce on a dish we haven't even glimpsed. I remember back around when things were going weird some years ago, I mentioned it to a close friend and he said, yeah, not only do I know what you mean, there isn't anyone else I've talked to this about, but I too had a sense that something was fundamentally going wrong. At that same time you did. At that same time your other friend did. And I said, well, what did it feel like? And he said, it felt like my sense of the future disappeared. And I thought that was really interesting and made sense to me and matched up with my own experience, in a deep way. And this was some months after the event, and I said, did it ever come back? And he said, no. Without a sense of the future, it's very difficult to understand what's important, what matters, what we should pay attention to, what we should ignore, where we should invest our awareness and activity and concern. As if there's a kind of inner compass, a prophetic compass, that we use to navigate in time and relation, behavior, habit, activity, and so on. And for many of us, this has exploded over the past few years. It's just shattered. There's a bunch of fragments floating around in a miasma. Now, one of the things that's been going on for the Earth is that the anciently conserved ecologies have been being mechanically obliterated and poisoned and ruined for a very short period of time, relatively speaking. Only really for perhaps the past 200 years, which isn't even a second in the time of the Earth. The anciently conserved ecologies, which are the foundations of our bodies and our minds and our hearts, have been being torn to shreds by the activities of our supercultures, primarily commerce, terrain dominance, and war. When our species first detonated a nuclear weapon, every life form on Earth was affected forever. And the Earth herself, in whatever ways it is that she has experience, and I use the feminine gender here just out of tradition, though it seems appropriate to me. The Earth got a hint that bad things were coming. But they came very quickly, and the previous extinction events weren't caused directly by humans. And the extinction events that we're in now are mostly caused by humans, but not merely. there are other forces at play. In fact, there are forces at play within the humans, which is very obvious if you look at the linear development of modern consciousness, population, behavior, priorities, activities, and so on, at the level of collectives, or what I prefer to call false collectives, because their collectivity is primarily nominal, which means it exists fundamentally in name alone. And that's not real collectivity, that's a fiction of collectivity. When we say the Americans, we're using this fiction of collectivity. It's an abstract generalization. But the Earth has been through extinction events before, and they were like strokes, and all of the life forms on Earth know that there's a few specific threats that are easily identified. One of them just drove by me. Machines. But I mean older stuff, before the humans built machines. There were threats like the sudden transformation in the sun, the impact of an object from outer space, or a sudden transformation of the Earth such that, for example, a sudden catastrophic release of methane from under the seafloor or from the Arctic ice. And in fact, Cinderella is a story, if one reads it this way, about the Earth responding to a catastrophe. When she loses one of her crystal slippers, that's her losing an ice cap. And the suitor can be understood as a gentle... So when things smash into the Earth, there's sort of two ways they can do it. And they can be mostly stony or mostly water, frozen water. A gentle suitor comes in at an angle and is probably mostly frozen water. And that suitor can bring important substances and materials, just as our own reproductive activity does. Right? A vicious suitor is a giant rock. And that rock is essentially a nuclear bomb. Single strike from a big enough rock can wipe out most of the anciently conserved ecologies and give the Earth a stroke. And the moon and the planets are involved in these events because they influence the paths of incoming large objects and even small objects. So the moon has protected the Earth from any strokes, any impact events. But the moon can't protect the Earth from the stroke the humans are giving her now. And I suspect that part of what's going on at the moment with time and nature is something we've never seen before, and perhaps has never been seen before on Earth, though there are some stories that claim it has. We're seeing a stroke caused by one of the life forms here. There actually was a really old situation where, as I understand it, the first life forms were cyanobacteria, and these forms, to them, oxygen was poison. And eventually forms arose that began to produce oxygen, and there was a transformation, there was a changing of the guard from the original organisms to the ones that used oxygen and could survive oxygen exposure. And so that was probably kind of a stroke, but It was a stroke that led to a new mind, new forms, and all of the life that we see today, which is the result of, well, one might think of it as the result of that transformation. But there's never been a situation where a single life form had the power to obliterate all the others, except very, very old ones before there were really even probably organisms as we understand them. Well, complex organisms anyway. And so the Earth is aware that we're giving her a stroke, and she's got to stop the bleed, right? Just like if we have a stroke and go to the hospital, the surgeons and so on will act urgently to contain the bleeding so that the brain doesn't die. And she has to stop that bleed, and we are the source of that bleed. Not so much the fact of our existence, but the way we exist in our machines and our endless capacity to kill off ecologies and produce objects. And you can see here something analogous to what we do with our minds. We kill off meaningful relationships and produce tokens that we exchange in language. And with each iteration of this habit, we lose touch with the original light, with our interiority, with our nature as living beings. And so I suspect that part of the thing that's going on in time that the women could sense and the little boy could sense and I can sense and other people I know can sense, although they don't think about it the same way. They don't have the same story or description or ideas. That's a signal and a symptom of something really fundamental changing in the local context. And the thing about Earth is that, I mean, one way I sometimes think about the Earth is if I choose to think about the Earth as female and the sun as male or masculine and feminine, and that's a choice. We can do all kinds of things with that, but I'm going to make that choice for the moment and accept whatever responsibility is necessary for stating it. Then the Earth is a bit like an egg in the gravity womb of the sun. A bit like an egg in a male womb, which we don't even have ideas about mostly in English, although there are ideas about this in Taoism. And the sun is the most gravitic, more than merely a being around here. And so it arbitrates and has profound effects on everything that enters its domain, gravitically, but also with heat and radiation and so on. We have old weird stories that are interesting about a king or sultan holding a contest to select a suitor for a princess. And my goodness, are there a lot of stories about this. And we can dismiss them if we want. Not telling anyone what to think or believe, but I certainly don't dismiss them. They remind me, just as the Cinderella story does, about things that happened before there were humans, about the conjugal relations of our world and time-space and the sun, the moon. Now, of course, the moon is the closest source of non-terrestrial gravity. So the moon is also deeply involved in these matters. And if you don't believe that, just take a look at the moon with a telescope and you'll see gigantic craters where objects that could either have severely damaged or obliterated life on Earth were absorbed by the moon, who has no problem absorbing such impacts, like a shield. But she doesn't just shield the Earth with her physical mass. Again, I'm using gendered language here, but I'm not scared. She transforms trajectories with gravity. Right? And so too does Jupiter and Saturn and Mars. And there's a whole ancient story here of the solar family that we know nothing of, but that some of our traditional stories and fairy tales likely contain the fossilized remains of. My point is this. In crisis, where there's the possibility of everything coming to an end, and there's nothing more valuable around here than the anciently conserved ecologies. Nothing. Those things are unimaginably precious and rare. And on many worlds with life, it's likely that the complex development of organisms is frequently interrupted by impacts or obliterated over and over again. And sometimes they don't come back. Sometimes a world thus devastated loses its capacity to hold an atmosphere. And that's one of the big threats around here. In any case, in crisis, lots of strange things happen. Once the news spreads that trouble is coming, all of the organisms can sense the future in their own way, and they will become very busy trying to make more organisms, trying to make new generations. And the humans are particularly like this. There's a propensity to become far more libidinous and interested in sex during crisis, just simply because whatever the universe might be, around here it loves to make children, and it'll do almost anything it can do to get babies being made. But in a crisis, that imperative becomes vastly more gravitic. And so all of the creatures are likely, and of course each one is unique and has their own way of being in the world. Nonetheless, they're also part of the hypersystem, and they have their unique way of participating in that. My point, though, that's, significantly frightening, is that if the humans put enough pressure on the Earth, and I think they succeeded at that about 100 years ago now, the Earth will call suitors. And that means impacts from space. But she will do other things too, because she remembers having had strokes and can tell that she's bleeding out in terms of her ecologies being decimated, and that process acquiring nonlinear progression, right? Geometric progression or algorithmic progression. And so when the Earth calls suitors, things get really dangerous around here in all kinds of ways. But there's another problem, which is simply that the humans are causing the bleed. To stop the bleed, she's got to stop the humans. And particularly, what she has to do is interrupt their addiction to machines and to omnicide. and probably vastly reduce their population over a very short period of time for us. Now, these things that I speak of are speculative. Nonetheless, they're matters I've spent decades considering and observing and reading about and studying, musing on. And not merely in my cognition, but in my heart, in my love affair with nature and the world and living beings. And when I say living beings, I mean all the beings who led up to them, too, right? Not just the ones that are alive right now. And even the context itself, right? The earth and the stones and the mountains and the lakes and the rivers and the waters and the sky and all these things. This is what I mean when I say living beings. Now, the earth has friends. And some of her friends are human beings. I hope I'm one of them, but I won't speak for the earth in that regard. I know many others who seem deeply sensitive and madly in love with the living beings and nature, the animals, everything, plants. And like a beleaguered kingdom whose princess can sense that they're about to be overrun by barbarians, the earth communicates with all of the beings that comprise her. And to those who will aid her, she will give special gifts. Just as a princess would say, come ye heroes who will rescue our kingdom from obliteration. I will open up the stores of the ancient powers, and I will grant you these powers to help us survive. And again, this is speculative and probably sounds kind of metaphysical. Be that as it may, something like this, something resembling it, is veritable. The humans are used to incredible luxury, actually unimaginable luxury, that is the result of the astonishing diversity and self-renewing nature of the anciently conserved ecologies. And so for the humans, most of them are just thinking things like, well, many of them, can't we just go back to how things were yesterday? For example, before the pandemic? No. There's no going back to that. And perhaps more troubling, most likely what's on the horizon will make the pandemic a happy memory. I don't usually come down on the side of what I'd call doom singing, but I am a little bit today, because our species has broken the vessel of life. And not only has it broken it, it continues to shatter the remaining pieces that might survive and become the seeds of survivable futures and futures richly endowed with possibility and intelligence and communion. And most of the individual people don't want to do this, though there are exceptions. There are some who do. And there are cohorts that are specifically interested in shutting down the processes that renew life on Earth. It's a very confusing imperative, but it's real. It's the kind of imperative that resulted in the explosion of machines and the world-killing weapons of war and commerce. So you can see it is as if our species is in the grip of something we could reasonably imagine as evil. Though I'm not sure that it's actively evil. It's not necessarily important to have a mean or cruel intention for terribly bad things to happen. One can simply defect from authenticity, and in that void left by that defection, terrible processes will naturally fill in the space, overtake it, become dominant, and ever more insistent on their dominance and propagation. And the same thing happens in our own minds, right? And some of the stories in religions have to do with this problem that we have of defection and the void, and it filling up with monsters. And there have been many times in history when our people all did exist, where there were terrible catastrophes and unexpected transformations of the world. But the humans weren't directly responsible for them, or at least it's unlikely that they were. I recall stories from Julian James's book where at one point in the history, perhaps of Babylon, in the archaeological record, there's a profusion of these little clay tablets that talk about the gods disappearing and the world being filled with demons. Now, these things are quite mysterious. We don't know exactly what they meant. And yet, I suspect that in our current situation, we may well have some direct modern experience of something similar. And it's too late to be careful so that doesn't happen. In fact, it was too late quite some time ago. Probably before I was born, it was already too late to avert these problems, because the humans were already dead set on, converting the ecologies to commodities, numbers in machines, bank accounts, weapons, so on. And there are those who will say things like, well, life on Earth will be fine. Even if the humans are wiped out, life will go on. It's okay. Those humans are wildly confused and living in an abstraction. They have no understanding of the importance of each of the forms of life on Earth. I guess they think that because there were previous extinction events, this one will be just fine too. Well, they wouldn't be thinking that way if they were talking about their mother or father or lover or brother or sister or child. And everybody on Earth has one or more of those roles. I'm going to pause for a moment and then I will return. Now, I adore the living world, and I also adore the humans. I don't think of them as disposable, even though as a species they're catastrophically misguided. But what I do understand from direct teaching by beings older than us is that in a crisis, Earth will call for help. And she has friends of kinds we cannot imagine. And there may also be monsters that are sensitive to vulnerability or disorientation, just like predators in nature are. It's interesting that the humans have so many myths about monsters. And I just want to be very clear about this. Those myths are nothing like the feeble imaginings of superstitious people. Nothing like that. Those myths are the result of having experience of monsters that obliterate the world or human minds, that feed on awareness and life. Our own species has become such a monster at the collective level. And at the same time, we are children of the earth. We are her body. So you can see the conflict and the problem there. I'm walking on sand near the ocean, reflecting on where did the sand come from? Perhaps it used to be mountains. Perhaps it used to be great stones, and now it's been ground to dust. Very uniform dust. Occasionally on my walk I've seen the footprint of an animal or a feather, evidence of life, of living beings traveling together in time. Our species has the capacity for incredible heroism, intelligence, insight, beauty, adoration, wonder, awe, reverence, participation in the great family of beings. And whether we're aware of it or not, we're always in relation with them. And perhaps when things are going relatively well, which they did for a long time around here, then our souls and minds are funded by the incredible symbiotic efflorescence of life on Earth. That asset's irreplaceable. But as the ecologies crash, our minds and bodies will crash with them. Because unlike our common ways of thinking, We are an expression of the anciently conserved ecologies in a way not entirely unlike how thoughts are an expression of the history of our awareness or consciousness and concern. And when we attack our own origins, whether in the world or in our own minds, apocalypse ensues. And there are all kinds of things that happen for individual humans, some of whom I know and love, where processes in their minds are doing the same thing, a similar thing, an analogous thing, to what the humans as a species are doing on Earth. They're attacking their own origin. And when processes in the mind attack their own origin, all kinds of terrifying things can occur, and sometimes some beautiful things too. But you can imagine if one of your hands suddenly had a mind of its own, and its primary agenda was to get rid of you, to hurt you, to cause damage, to dominate you. And how incredibly difficult it would be for you to do anything at all while one of your own hands was constantly, physically working to harm you. Well, this is the position, this is analogous to the situation on Earth with the humans. One of her organs, and interestingly, one of the particular organs that might be able to protect her from the old kind of stroke, right? From a large incoming stone from space that would wipe everything out, maybe even including her atmosphere. Our species is probably the single greatest investment of life energy ever made on our world, and that's not an accident. I'm not sure we have a purpose, because nature doesn't really work that way, in my view. But there are purposive histories that underlie our emergence as animals on Earth and our development. And some of those histories are mysterious, and some of them probably directly involve other intelligences of which we've no idea and have rarely been bold enough to imagine. I was talking with a friend the other night, and it was a moment of deep emotion, because people we love are dying. And we ourselves are dying. I am getting old. Many of my friends are old. Some of them have died. Some have had strokes or heart attacks or terrible accidents. And I remarked on the topics that I've orbited here and said, you know, it feels to me like the Earth has to interrupt the humans. They won't interrupt themselves. They're not going to listen to anything. They want to go back to what they think of as normal life, which really is absolutely abnormal for living beings on a living world. And the idea that we'll find a new home in space, while not entirely impossible, is both ridiculous and dangerous in all kinds of ways that no one's thinking carefully about. You don't give a teenager who burnt down their whole city a new city with innocent people to live in, right? Because there's a reason why they burnt down their city. They're delusional and insane. And something's driving them to delusion and insanity. At the same time, it's a moment of great opportunity for insight and learning and understanding and transformation, even local to ourselves. Because in great crisis and catastrophe, some of the finest and truest lights of our nature as humans are called forth into expression. In a moment where hope has died and faith in the future is languishing, this is a beautiful moment to change our path and to learn something deep and fulfilling about our nature as beings and organisms and humans, about our world, about ourselves, about each other. The same way as when there's, an accident or a crisis, the humans will suddenly form cohorts and risk their lives to make things better, to heal, to stop the bleed. We have time senses. We have senses of the character of time, the character of history, and our bodies are in some way related to these senses, because not only do we have these senses as humans, we are expressions of these senses on Earth. The Earth, too, can sense futures and understands the meanings of histories in her own ways. And it may be that our species was the result of her sensing something in the far future for us, and establishing and nurturing us and embarking on the great gamble of giving birth to a species like ours, capable of representational cognition and tool making, capable of weapon building. Perhaps our truest nature as beings is to love and protect the earth and all the families of life who have ever lived here, and to fulfill the promise of their existence and their dreams and their hopes and their suffering by doing something so astonishingly beautiful that it rebalances all of the atrocity and suffering. I believe in this path. In my own very humble way, I try to walk in this path. But for the moment, I think there's great mystery afoot, and lots of crisis is coming. If the earth tries to attract suitors, we're going to see radical transformations in the terrestrial environment, unlike anything we've ever seen in modern time. and surely many of us will perish. In fact, all of us will perish. We are mortal in this way. Yet even this is mysterious. And the idea is stranger than our conception of it. I don't want to go back to how things were before the pandemic. In fact, I'm hopeful that forces beyond our ken will intervene and essentially demand that the humans remember what it means to be human, what it means to be a being in an organism, in a family of beings and organisms, reaching back and forward into time in every moment. But I don't think it'll be pretty. That hand that I spoke of has to be dealt with in some way. And it looks to me like the most likely method will involve complexly layered catastrophes. Earthquakes, tsunamis, wars, diseases, the apocalyptic treasure trove with which our books have terrified us. The Greeks were aware that hubris summons Nemesis. And it's unfortunate that we haven't been able to yet establish a distributed intelligence in our collectives. In some cases, the distributed intelligences of the world have established unique small cohorts or individuals who have great insight and love and wonder and intelligence. But we haven't been able to return something like that to our collectives. They are insane, wildly disoriented, and bent on summoning Nemesis in every way we can possibly get on with that. So that epoch,
They don't want to have you schedule it until you actually come to get
forgive the wind, I can't control it. But that epoch is coming to a close, I think. And it may happen, it's already happening, but we may see the large-scale repercussions of that quite soon. Or it may take a little while longer yet. But the Earth is responding, and she has friends, and perhaps also enemies. Or at least beings that see her as prey and are watching for signs of disorientation and disembodiment. And the humans are making this sign, and they're making it very loudly. Anything that can read light and see the Earth from space knows what's going on here. In the light that Earth reflects, she tells a story to time-space. And for a long time, that story was one of incredible beauty and abundant progeny, abundant children. But over the past 200 years, that story has changed. And the atmospheric envelope of our world is certainly singing a story of crisis to time-space now. For those of us who are capable and willing to go all in for the earth and her children and her histories and futures, we may gain friends and allies of kinds we've never thought about. But there's danger there too, because we are naive about such matters. And something that appears as an ally might be a predator. And this is one of the significant problems of the kinds of minds we have. Minds whose own faculties can attack their coherence and origin, their structure and health, their intelligence. Well, I hope you will forgive me if I've been doom singing a bit today. Not one of my preferred song modes, but I have good reason to take a moment and spend some time there today. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to explore and learn. And I'm not interested in telling anyone what's going on. And I'd love to hear from anyone who can see further than me, or more deeply, or who can contradict me, so that I can learn from having made some mistake here. I talk to the sun, I talk with the trees, I'm about to talk with the ocean for a moment, and I talk with you. Thank you for accompanying me today, and I look forward to more learning and exploration and dreaming and healing together very soon. Bye-bye for now.